All right then, Econ friends, welcome back to our next series. We're now in topic 12, and here we'll be talking about the ADAS model. Let's jump in with the definition. The ADAS, or the full name, the Aggregate Demand, Aggregate Supply Model, is a macroeconomic model that explains some of the major economic changes that occur throughout the entire economy. So all those things that we've talked about so far, recessions and booms and inflation, as well as all those different parts of the business cycle, we're going to bring together and analyze through the context of this ADAS model, okay? So again, AD, aggregate demand, AS, aggregate supply. And together, this model is a really powerful macroeconomic model that helps us explain and make sense of all those different phenomena, all those different themes that we've talked about since we started macro. Now, when you jump into ADAS, a lot of it's going to look and seem sort of familiar, sort of intuitive. But to be really clear, this is not the old supply and demand model from the beginning of class, okay? So it's really important that you understand that even though they look the same, they behave the same, they're fundamentally different. Mainly because, whereas the supply and demand model that we learned earlier, where we analyze the price and the quantity of one item, what's the P and Q of nachos, the P and Q of beer, the equilibrium P and Q of university tuition and number of seats offered. Whereas that was one item, the ADAS model focuses on what we're going to call aggregate. So the ADAS focuses on aggregate outcomes, which means total or economy-wide. So we're not going to be focusing here on the market for one item. We're going economy-wide. We're at the aggregate total level. So this ADAS model is going to focus on aggregate outcomes in the economy, specifically total output, which, as you know, is measured by real GDP. And we've covered our formula of new minus old divided by old to get that growth rate. So specifically total output, as well as average prices, which, as you know, is going to be measured by the price level. So what we're going to do is take some of those early variables that we studied in macro, the inflation rate, the price level, and the output rate, the real GDP, and we're going to be bringing those back in together into the ADAS model, okay? Once we put it all together, this model is going to help us make sense of a few important things. It'll help us understand significant historical macro events like the Great Depression, as well as all those things that we've been talking about up to now, things like recessions and booms, and inflation and unemployment, and even the role that monetary and fiscal policy can play in helping us keep an economy stable, at least in theory, okay? So the model also helps us to understand, like I just said, how monetary policy and fiscal policy can influence the economy. You recall from previous lectures that monetary policy was changing the money supply to change the interest rates, and fiscal policy was changing G or tax rates. But with the ADAS model, we're going to be able to actually graphically see when to use those tools and how those tools manifest and play out. And that's an important way to bring all those different pieces together. You can kind of think of the ADAS model as being a complete picture, like a complete puzzle. All those pieces from before, the different data points and economic growth and monetary and fiscal policies and recessions and inflations, all those separate pieces we're going to bring together, and ADAS model will help us see one unified whole picture, okay? To understand this model, let's break it down into its three components, because at its core, the ADAS model just has three parts. The first part, aggregate demand, AD. And this is the total demand. So aggregate demand, AD, is the total demand for all goods and services at a given price level. The second component of this model is the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay, the short run aggregate supply curve, which we'll abbreviate to SRAS. This is going to be the total amount of goods and services supplied in the short run. Now you say, well, what is the short run? Well, the short run refers to a time period before wages and prices have had time to adjust. We'll get to this in a bit more detail in a minute. But it's really important as we now move into the short run and the long run discussion that you understand the difference in the context of macroeconomics. So our first component, aggregate demand, pretty straightforward. Our second component, short run aggregate supply, SRAS, which again is the total amount of goods and services supplied in the short run. The short run is a time period when we have not been able to fully adjust wages and prices. One way to think about it is this. In the short run, and again, the short run has no specific time length. So I don't want you to think about short run as, a year or less. We don't know what the time frame is. So don't think of it in terms of an actual chronological timeline. Think of it conceptually. In the short run, some prices, especially those in labor markets, which we know as the wage, they're set by contracts and agreements. Lots and lots of workers have employment contracts, and unions set up long-term employment arrangements for their union members. And that basically is a contract that locks employers, okay, that locks firms, bosses, into particular pay windows. And they can't just adjust it whenever they choose because they're locked into contractual obligations. In the short run, since some of these prices, especially wages, are set by contracts and agreements, households and businesses cannot adjust those prices when economic conditions change. So basically in the short run, we're stuck with particular prices and wages. And that has an implication that we'll discuss later. The third component of this model is long run aggregate supply. So we're still talking about AS, ag supply, but this is long run aggregate supply, and they're treated separately, okay? So we're gonna have three components, the AD, the SRAS, and the LRAS. But note that even though short run ag supply and long run ag supply are both supply curves, they're totally different and they're treated separately. The long run aggregate supply curve is the total amount of all goods and services supplied, as the name says, in the long run. And the long run occurs to the period after wages and prices have had time to adjust. You can think about the long run conceptually as any time period that's long enough so that prices are no longer fixed. All those different arrangements, contractual arrangements, employee-employer agreements that would lock wages or other prices in for a set time, we're past that window. So in the long run, all prices, the prices of goods and services, as well as wages, the prices of labor, they're fluid and they can adjust in the long run. And as a result of that, in the long run, people, meaning households and businesses, the employers and households, they can modify their behavior in response to price changes. So we have three key components in this model: aggregate demand, AD, the short run aggregate supply, SRAS, and the long run aggregate supply, LRAS. One final thing I want to point out to you, a definition that we're going to see throughout this model. In this model, The term shocks refers to any sudden, large, and unexpected change in either AD or SRAS. So we've got this model. This is a brief overview. We know our three parts. We know about the long-term, short-term distinction, and we know that this model will be affected by supply or demand shocks. That's it for this brief intro. In our next video, we'll dig in a lot deeper to those three components, and then in later videos, we'll put them all together. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in a bit.